Greetings and welcome to the Global Unites webinar series for this month of September. It's my honor and privilege today to have Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez joining us for this conversation. He's an expert on transitional justice processes, and he's going to share his experiences, especially for a question that many of you asked last time, as how can young people play a role in this transitional justice process? In many of our countries, we've been through a lot of violent conflict, and we're looking to rebuild. And as we're looking to rebuild, we believe that young people have a very important role to play in the process of reconciliation and helping the country develop again. But what about specifically on issues of justice? So today we're glad that you're joining us, and we're honored once again to have Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you to you.
So you've been engaged in this kind of work for many years. In fact, as I was reading your bio, you have worked in 15 countries as a consultant and helped with their transitional justice processes. How did this journey start? What drew you to be involved in this kind of work?
Well, I have always been interested in social activism since I was in college, and it was also a very difficult time in my own country because I was growing up in a country in conflict. Peru had a 20-year-long armed conflict between an illegal armed organization called the Shining Path and the Peruvian state forces. So growing up in Peru, it was impossible not to think of issues of social justice, issues of peace, and issues of human rights. So it was very important for me. I remember one of the first things that I probably did at that time when I was younger was the organization of a movement against the application of the death penalty in Peru. It was at the time at which the government was utilizing a populist appeal to the population to support the death penalty as part of an effort to conservatize society. And so I think that was the first time when I linked my social activism with something that led me to a human rights perspective. I started to think, why was it that the death penalty was not just morally repugnant, but also unfair? What rights were affected by it? And I think that is probably when it started to be a significant question for me. And that was in the early 90s.
Yeah. So following that, when you started entering into this process of transitional justice and helping in your own country, what was that first experience like, and how do you remain optimistic about justice in the midst of so much of violent conflict, in the midst of so many of these crimes going unnoticed? How did you feel optimistic to pursue forward?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I don't know if I would describe myself necessarily as an optimist. I tend to think that if I look at things dispassionately, things are pretty bleak, and sometimes you feel very pessimistic about it. So I guess rationally I'm pretty much pessimistic, but there is always some measure of hope in what people can do to change things. And I have been witness that a few people with energy and a few people guided by ideals can really transform a situation that seems negative. So I would say pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of hope and faith, I would say. So what I have seen in many transitions to democracy, and certainly in my own country, in Peru, in the 90s, was that there are moments in which regimes that are authoritarian look extremely strong, look unmovable. Look like they have taken over the press, the political institutions, that they have bought individuals, that they have bought consciences, etc. But at the same time, there are always people who resist. This capacity to resist, this capacity to affirm moral values is never completely gone from a society. And I think youth that tends to be very idealistic is always a source of strength in those situations.
So you have seen young people being a source of strength to you personally and for your conviction and helping ignite your hope in the midst of that. How has that appeared to be the case? And also, if I want to continue on that line, In all of your years of experience, what are certain moments where you felt this worked, this made a difference? And how have you continued to push on in situations where you felt justice was not met?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my personal experience as a Peruvian citizen, I saw at many moments, probably the moments in which you would give up reading the news, that the source of hope was the voice of young people saying enough is enough. When we were in the middle of the Fujimori dictatorship in the 1990s in Peru, it was young people from the universities who took to the streets to protest against the ways in which the government trampled the constitution. When after the dictatorship there was another kind of dictatorship, which is neoliberal economics, when governments started to impose terrible conditions on young people going into the labor market, it was again young people who went to the street to ask for their legal rights as workers. So I think that is something that I have seen in many occasions, and it gives me a lot of hope. In countries like Colombia, which I know quite well, I think, it's very interesting that the peace movement has always been a youth movement. For a long time, there was something called Children for Peace in Colombia. It was an organization that was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize back in the years in which it was very, very difficult. And so I have the impression that I have always seen young people and youth movements playing a very positive role in the construction of peace and in human rights.
So in moments where you feel that justice wasn't achieved, politicians turned the other way, or even civil society neglected their duty, and those situations where many would be discouraged, and even a lot of young people I've spoken to feel that it's almost not worth it. What have you taken out of it to believe we need to push on, we need to not give up in these moments? Especially for those young people who are watching right now, even when we talked about this topic, saying, is it even practical? Is this going to happen? Our politicians have let us down so many times, and these are big government processes. And how have you encouraged yourself to keep on, and can you give that advice to our young people?
Well, that sounds like very old young people, no? Because I would understand cynicism and skepticism when you have been around for decades and you have been trying and hitting a wall for a long time. But I don't know, if you're in your 20s, I don't know that you have really much behind to say politicians are always like this. I think probably what happens in many occasions is that young people are repeating what is told to them in their circles, in their group, in their social group, in their families, in their communities. And certainly if you come from a community and a region and a place that is feeling dejected, that is feeling marginalized, it is very normal that young people are going to say that. But in terms of their own really individual personal experience, I think that there are other ways in which you can react when you are young to what happens around you. And you can certainly take two attitudes. Either you are going to take reality and see it through the eyes of those who came before you and are telling you that reality is this or that, or you take a different attitude and you think, I am going to look at reality in the measure of my energies, in the measure of my own wishes and my own desires to do something different, to do something else. Youth, after all, is a period where people are looking for some sense, for some meaning. And typically that meaning is found in your own movement. It's not necessarily given to you by society. So it's a very interesting moment. And young people who find themselves in the midst of a country in change, a country in flux, actually have a lot of possibilities to have an influence at that moment.
Yeah, very well said. So for those of you who are feeling, is this even worth our time? Do we engage? It was very encouraging words from Mr. Gonzalez. Especially I know for young people in the northern east of Sri Lanka, it's been almost 9 years since the war ended. In Uganda, it's been almost 17 years since the new regime was coming into place at the time. And many of these countries, they're waiting. Even in South Africa, yes, systems have come into place, but they're waiting for answers. So we're hoping that this conversation will give you some sort of steps of how do youth play a role in the transitional justice process. But before we get to that, I'd like to refresh the memory of our audience, and also for those who are joining us for the first time. How would you define transitional justice? What's the parameters of our conversation today? And then we'll talk about the role of youth from there.
Yes, well, it's a concept that perhaps sounds like an intimidating concept. It's such a very specific word, right? Transitional justice. Actually, I think that we need to look at the substance rather than the actual word. It basically alludes to the situation of countries that are trying to build a democracy after a period of authoritarian rule, countries that are trying to build peace after a period of conflict, and ask themselves, what are we going to do about the massive human rights violations of the past? Are we just going to let bygones be bygones, or are we going to do something about the abuse that we suffered? It's a very simple question, but the answers are not so simple. So the field of transitional justice refers to all those policies that countries put in place to confront the legacy of mass violations from a recent past. So countries like my own country, Peru, which suffered the double punch of an internal conflict and a dictatorship, had to ask themselves, now that the dictator is gone, now that the conflict is over, can we really build a democracy? Can we really build peace without looking at the past? Without attending to the voices of the relatives of the missing? Can we really build something sustainable if people who committed war crimes are free in the streets? And we said, no, that's not possible. And when we started to look into the past, we were basically doing transitional justice. We were not using the term. No one was saying we are doing transitional justice. We were just saying we are addressing the past and we are building democracy. The only way to do that is to ensure that the crimes that took place in the past, the abuses that took place in the past, are not going to be acceptable anymore and are going to be punished.
So what do you tell to some people who say, are we, in the process of transitional justice or in the process of trying to find answers, are we digging dirt from the past? Are we capable to handle what the dirt that we see? Will that cause new violence? Should we truly let bygones be bygones? To those people who believe that to be true, how would you address that?
Well, I think that the way to address that is to have some empathy and put yourselves in the shoes of the people who are still suffering for this. The people who say that you shouldn't look into the past are typically people who can afford to not look into the past because they have not been personally touched by violence. But there are people who have been touched. What are you going to say to the mother of a person who is missing? Are you going to tell to that mother, don't look into the past, you are reactivating hate and anger? This woman has to know because she's suffering today, in the present, day after day, the torture of not knowing what happened with her loved ones. So I would say that when you look into the past, you're really not digging because the past is right there. No one even took the effort to dig it, to cover it up. It's right there for everyone to see. So in reality, we need to deal with it because it's a mess that we need to deal with if we want to have a better future. And let me add something. For youth, looking into the past and looking into abuses, crimes, violations is actually a very existential thing to do because the country they are going to live in the next 40, 50, 60 years is a country where these kind of crimes can happen again if they don't do anything about it. You know, if you are in your 60s, well, probably you can afford to not look into the past.
Yeah.
But if you're in your 20s, you need to look into the past because this is the country you are going to be living in. This is the world in which you're going to be living in.
That's very well said. And that has proven to be true, where history has repeated itself. Unaddressed grievances continue to haunt countries time and time again. within our own context here in Sri Lanka, it seems like every 15 to 18 years there's a cycle of violence. In Uganda, in Kenya, and places like that, there seems to be a recurring trend here. Now, obviously there isn't a guarantee just because you engage in transitional justice, violence won't happen again. But what are some examples where we've seen, because it's been addressed well, that cycle of violence has been stopped?
Mm-hmm. Well, we can do the exercise in both ways, right? We can look at places where the cycle of violence come again and again, and places where they are being stopped, right? And you said very well, societies where there are ethnic differences, and each community has its own history, and does not find common ground with the other communities, are societies where the tension subsists, right? Where people not only don't have a common history with the people of another community, but don't have friendships, don't have family relations, don't do business together, etc. And of course, in a society like that, you basically are coexisting, but you are not really reconciled. And so tensions can always escalate, and that is extremely dangerous. Look at places like the former Yugoslavia. People from different communities there went to war in several occasions in the course of a lifetime. There were people who were young in the time of World War II that had to see war happening again in the 80s and 90s. Look at places like Northern Ireland, where tensions between Catholics and Protestants have re-emerged again and again. I guess the way to try to at least build non-recurrence, build resilience in a society, is not going to have a silver bullet. I think looking into the past to do justice is one element, but other elements are to have a new constitution, to have new political agreements between the communities, to share power, to have a new and better economy, to try to have a common sense of prosperity. So without action in the fronts of justice, political agreements and economic prosperity, I think that the past can re-emerge again and again. It requires a very integral response in all the fields.
So you mentioned a very important thing there. It was not a one-off response saying, okay, we do transitional justice, reoccurrence is stopped. But you're saying, no, you have to do that along with maybe constitutional reform, agreements, and then all these things coming together. It's sort of a holistic model of ensuring that the past doesn't repeat itself. So these are very important components for us to continue to dig into and explore. But before I do that, I just want to ask our viewers, thank you for viewing. We're getting responses from Liberia, from Kenya, obviously from Sri Lanka, and all across Sri Lanka, Mathura and Mulativ and places like that. Thank you for letting us know that you're watching, but you can feel free to share questions as you have in the past. Just write a comment with your question and we would definitely respond to that as it appears. So just going to those components of things that you said, if these things are in place, the possibility of breaking the cycle are higher. How do young people contribute to that? How do we engage? How do we ask these people who are watching in countries of conflict, here, these are certain steps you can take?
I think there are many things that young people can demand and also things that young people can do on their own. First of all, I think, for example, that the field of education is a wide open field for the activism of young people. Young people are the first ones who could be asking in high school or could be asking in college to have honest discussions about the past, to have comprehensive reforms of the syllabus, of the list of texts and bibliography, of the debates that need to happen in the classroom in order to have a better understanding of the past. So interacting with teachers, interacting with parents to look into better education of history and civics is fundamental. And that is a big area open there for young people. Another thing that I think can happen is the capacity of young people to engage with people across communities, right? Precisely because the attitudes are not completely set. People from different communities, when they are young, can still interact a bit. So areas like sports, areas like culture, areas like music and dance and theater are areas where young people can interact and can start building these relations. And the other thing that I think is difficult but important is also what happens in the private sphere, what happens in the house with parents and with people from the previous generations. It is often said that Germany didn't overcome the legacy of Nazism until the young generations in the 60s started to ask their parents what was it like under the fascist dictatorship, when they started to ask their parents very directly, so what did you do? And when they started to ask uncomfortable questions in the midst of their families, their towns, their communities. And it is only then that really Germany went beyond just the facade of not being fascist anymore, and it went to the internalizing of anti-fascist attitudes. So that needs to happen. This moment of youth rebellion, when young people have to ask the uncomfortable questions and have to have the honest discussions with parents and grandparents, even though they are not visible, even though they are not out there in the public sphere, are elements that need to happen, are elements that are going to build the trust and the self-confidence to go forward with these very difficult issues.
It's extremely helpful and insightful. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question here from Paivi Nikanda. Paivi hasn't mentioned where they're viewing from, but the question is, when should the transitional justice process start, and who should lead them in their society?
I think I have seen Paivi in Twitter. So Paivi, if you are seeing this, hello. I think I follow you on Twitter.
Okay.
Well, it's a classic question. It's a very good question indeed. I think that with transitional justice there are a number of orthodoxies that typically don't help because they make us very inflexible. The orthodox traditional view of this issue is that you have to wait until everything is over, until you have a full-fledged new democracy, a complete process of peace to start. And a very traditional way of looking at it is that this is a top-down process, that governments have to dictate policies, and that is what transitional justice is about. And I think we need to be more flexible and more creative about it. First of all, I have seen countries where the conflict is still going on and people are engaging in truth-telling, for example. So places like Colombia, they are still negotiating peace with some of the guerrilla movements there, but in Colombia they started looking for the past and into human rights violations a long time ago. They never stopped looking into human rights violations, and they never stopped looking into the truth. So it doesn't need to start when everything is over. It actually can happen all the time. Second, it doesn't have to be top-down. It is true that governments have a legal obligation to fulfill human rights policies and to look into the past, therefore, but it doesn't mean that society needs to wait for that to happen. Society can do their own processes of transitional justice, and it has been doing that in many places. I have seen how, for example, in the United States, in the last couple of years, African American communities have been doing their own truth commissions to react to police brutality against African American population. And it is these activists in the movement Black Lives Matter, for example, who are not waiting for the government of the United States to institute mechanisms of justice, truth, and reparation. They are going themselves to their communities to have people tell their stories. So I would say transitional justice needs to start when the movements are ready to make it start. And transitional justice doesn't need to be led by government necessarily. There will be an interaction between government and society. In my experience, governments have the responsibility to act, but governments need to be sometimes prodded by civil society activism, and not just by your classical, let's say, communicational strategies, but also by civil society doing things. In some places in my region in Latin America, for a long time, governments didn't do anything on looking for the truth about past violations, and it was civil society organizations that did their own truth commissions. People are surprised when I tell them that before there was a truth commission in Guatemala, there was a truth commission launched by the Catholic grassroots movements in Guatemala. Before there was a truth commission in Brazil, there was a truth commission of the social movements in Brazil. And the same happened in Colombia, the same happened in Uruguay, in many countries.
So you're saying that we don't have to wait for government and established structures to engage. Grassroots movements can be proactive in the midst of what's going on. So that's very connected to the question coming in from Uganda, from Amos Chiangi. He says, how do grassroots movements like Uganda Unites get key stakeholders such as governments on board for key aspects of having transitional justice when they believe that there is peace and transitional justice, when peace and transitional justice is not required? When the state is saying, not necessary, what you're doing is irrelevant, how do these movements react?
Well, I think that states usually cannot afford to say that. Typically, states have, at the very least, need to respond to these issues, and at the very least, they say, no, we are going to focus on this. So in places like Uganda, for example, the government has been saying for a long time that they are committed to a process of peace in the north of Uganda with the so-called Lord Resistance Army, a very brutal organization that has enslaved children and has committed horrendous atrocities against conscripted kids. So in places like Uganda, for example, the government may be saying different things, right? Sometimes they will say, no, this is irrelevant. But then when they are in front of the international community, they say, no, of course it is important. So I guess what young people and what good activists have to do is catch the government in those inconsistencies, right? And demand consistency, demand integrity. The other thing that young people can do, and they are doing this in Uganda, by the way, and in other places, is to take action themselves. When young people, for example, start collecting stories across communities of what was the impact or what is the impact of conflict in their lives, that eventually creates a critical mass. That eventually gets to society, and it will get to government. The role of young people and the role of youth movements is to keep governments on their toes. Remember that if you are young, you may feel that society doesn't pay much attention to you, that you're not powerful, that you're not important. But remember that in reality, everyone is looking on what you do, because they know that you have the energy and that you are going to take over eventually. So young people are way more powerful than they believe they are.
Just want to add to something you said, Amos. This might be helpful as well. In Sri Lanka's context, in the previous regime, there were times where they would come out and speak about the end of conflict, or end of the war was the end of the conflict. And the end of the war was actually an emergence of reconciliation, and not addressing some of those issues. And in the context of like that, the Sri Lanka Unites movement, I believe, we tried efforts to just hear the stories of people in the north and east and help people from the south and the west of the country hear these stories, hear their grievances and empathize with them. And we felt that was our little own version of truth commissions and beginning the process. And I know many young people in the south from that point onwards had a commitment to see government take a stand as well, but they also wanted to listen and be part of creating sustainable solutions. Moving on to another question from Luis.
But if you allow me,
Sure.
there maybe something that we need to recognize is that even when a government proclaims that conflict is over, even when the situation in the terrain is a situation of non-conflict because no one is shooting, we need to remember that conflict goes on here and here. Yeah. That people still don't trust another community, that resentment still runs deep, that people do not empathize with the suffering of people because they are from another community. So the reality is that conflict continues, and that it is pretty much the responsibility of the younger generations to see that this continuing conflict is actually addressed. So things like what you mentioned, building empathy between young people from different communities is a measure in that road.
And so having the people who share the grievance is actually consistent evidence that the conflict is not over.
Yeah.
Violent conflict may have ended, but there is issues that need to be addressed. Luis Duana, please forgive me if I misspelled or mispronounced your name. From what the speaker just said a while back, is that to mean that justice to be effective in a particular state, for war or not, or its components have to start from the very beginning? Please clarify.
Where is Luis writing from?
I am not sure. Luis has not mentioned the country they're from.
Well, I do think that victims of these violations, of these crimes, have rights. Victims have rights to know the truth, to know what has happened, and society has a right to know what happened. Victims also have the right to be compensated, to have a reparation for the experiences that they suffered. Victims, of course, have the right to pursue justice, to see that the courts of law act on the people who committed these horrible crimes. So, since all of those are rights, it follows that governments need to act on all those fields. Governments need to look into the truth of what happened. Governments need to afford reparations for people who suffered. And governments need to do measures of justice. So in principle, to me, yes, everything should start together. Now, having said that, it is very rare to have everything happening together because institutions typically are inefficient. There are not necessarily a lot of capacities in a country coming out of conflict. I have been in places like Liberia, for example, where after a very destructive conflict, the institutions were destroyed, where the judicial system was destroyed by long years of conflict and oppression, where the executive itself was being rebuilt, where the capacities to govern the country were very weak. So sometimes it's difficult to start everything at the same time. But that should be actually a realization to try to do things better, not to substitute one thing for the other. What I think Luis is suggesting, if I understand the subtext of his question correctly, is that victims of past crimes have rights, and that those rights have to be addressed integrally.
Mm-hmm. Another question for you, Mr. Gonzalez, from South Sudan. It's from Manyange Gakwich, and says, working with International Youth for Africa, IYA, in South Sudan, why is transgender justice as a tool for accountability and reconciliation? Why is transgender justice an important tool for accountability and reconciliation? Mm-hmm.
Well, South Sudan is a very extreme situation, and I see why these issues are being asked. When conflict is still raging, and when the difficulties that conflict imposes are still being felt in life, those are situations that for which we all around the world need to feel a lot of empathy. And precisely in these situations, when you see what's going on, you realize that what a society really needs is rule of law. Precisely when you are in the middle of a conflict, precisely when you see how little value armed actors give to human life, precisely in those moments is when you realize how much a society needs rule of law, how much society needs working institutions to deal with grievances, to deal with differences. I would say to our friend in South Sudan that yes, justice is extremely necessary, because justice is not just what happens in a court of law in some kind of very specialized, a solemn chamber with judges in togas. Justice is what happens in day-to-day life. Justice is what happens when young people have education, when families have something to eat, when people have the possibility of a dignified work and the expectation that no one is going to destroy a community. In places that are still going conflict, like South Sudan, justice is part of the answer. Peace cannot be built just because in some way or another the armed actors realize that they have to put down their weapons or silence their weapons for a bit. Justice is certainly stopping the shooting, but justice is also building institutions and building rule of law.
We have another question from Tilina, from the southern part of Sri Lanka, from Matara. He asks, what types of transitional justice mechanisms are available to human rights defenders? When is it best to engage these mechanisms? Do you have examples of when they have been used successfully? And here's one more. What impact have these transitional justice mechanisms had on civil society? So we'll start with the first one. What types of transitional justice mechanisms are available for human rights defenders?
Well, typically, transitional justice can be put in place with very different institutions. So, for example, one that is mentioned a lot, truth commissions. That is a commission that is non-judicial but looks into the past to establish the truth about what happened and to give a voice to victims. That's one type of mechanism. And if done correctly, is a place where human rights activists can participate very actively to ascertain what happened in the past and to contribute to determine what happened in the past. Also, another important mechanism are offices for missing persons. That is, there has to be an institution in countries that have suffered this kind of situation to look into the fate and the whereabouts of people who went missing or were forcibly disappeared. In places like Sri Lanka, that is, of course, fundamental. It has happened along decades of the country's past, and not just in one region, but in all regions, not just in one conflict, but in all the recent conflicts. So the search for the missing is also another institution and another mechanism that is going to need the interaction with human rights movements and activists. Reparations is another important institution. There needs to be some kind of government institution that is going to recognize the status of people as victims and is going to put together certain instruments to help, like psychosocial attention, like mental health support, like physical health support, some transfers of cash, of money, or services for people who need to rebuild. And then, of course, justice. Criminal justice, special courts, special mechanisms for accountability are all necessary. The courts of law are also a mechanism for transitional justice. And in all of those, civil society and human rights activists need to have a very active role.
And when do you think it's best to engage? That's the question that he had.
From the very beginning, because even when an instrument has not been established, for example, an office on missing persons, when they are still working on it and when it's still not in place, even then something is happening, right? Policies are being made, decisions are being taken regarding how this institution is going to look. The law is being written or is being designed for these instruments. So at that point, people need to engage anyway to express their demands, to express their expectations of what is the kind of work that this institution is going to have. So I think the right moment to engage is always now. It's always yesterday, really. You should have engaged already. So and you need to be always knocking on that door and pushing on that door to make sure that government listens.
Are you of the opinion that there's ever a period of time where it's too late? Where it's been 2 decades since the war is over, many of that generation has passed on. Is it too late? I know that in South Korea's context, many women who were used as comfort well, I'm not even comfort.
The so-called comfort women, yes.
Comfort women to the Japanese soldiers at the time. They're in their 90s now, and some of them, very few of them are left, but they're still seeking justice.
Yeah.
And is it too late? Is there ever a point where it's too late?
Well, yes and no. Sadly, sometimes justice comes too late for the direct victims who suffered on this situation. Just last week, the mother of one of the disappeared in Peru, a very brave lady called Mama Angelica, passed away. She was in her 80s and she had been fighting for over 30 years after the disappearance of her young son. And she died just a week after a court of law in Peru condemned to 30 years in prison the military men who disappeared her son. So she was so stubborn that she didn't want to leave this world until she saw a measure of justice happening. Still, I cannot help but think that in some ways it was late for so many mothers who have died without seeing justice done. Or even for Mama Angelica, who found justice against the perpetrators, against the killers, but did not find the remains of her son, because the perpetrators never confessed what they did with the remains of the disappeared. So in some sense, this is sad and is devastating to know that yes, for some people it will be late. But in a larger sense, in a historical sense, it's never late. And in fact, if you don't act today, you are just kicking the ball to the next generation and you're making the problem worse. You mentioned the case of the South Korean women who were taken into forced sexual slavery by the Japanese army in the 40s. And it's not just South Korean women, Indonesian women, women in the Philippines, in China, etc. And you see that it is still now urgent to look into the past, because these kind of situations still poison the relations between Japan and its neighbors. So even today, the perception that it has not been fully addressed is something that complicates relations between neighbors that should have a better, more harmonious relation. And even when the direct victims are no longer with us, the fact is that these stories, these grievances live on for generations. Think of the fact that we are witnessing in the last few months. Think of the United States, a place where white supremacists are still claiming, are still clinging to a story, a falsified story, a revisionist story, where they are the victims of some kind of offense by the North or by minorities. And think of how African American activists, Latino activists are responding to that, demanding that the past is actually addressed. Because even in a nation where the Civil War ended a century and a half ago, even in such a nation, people see grievances today. People see statues consecrated, monuments and museums consecrated to defenders of slavery. So it's not too late to address these situations, because the past is never past. It's still there, and you will need to respond to it.
Yeah. Going to the context of the United States, and that's something that many of us who've been talking about countries in the developing world in the midst of conflict, but we realize is even in the Western world, even in the developed world, some of these grievances that were not addressed continue to haunt societies. How do you encourage young people in that context who want to positively, proactively engage? What are some steps they can take when government and state haven't still taken certain actions to do certain things, or maybe there's still policies are being formulated? What do they do from the bottom up? How do they react to this? Obviously, it's not a violent solution, but non-violently, what can they do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, look, I don't think that it's my place to say to young people what they should do. But I do think that they are already doing things. And perhaps what we need to encourage is for young people to look into what other young people are doing. Today, we are in a situation that is very unique and that was not the case when I was in my 20s, which is that young people can learn from young people around the world because of the phenomenal development of communications, social networks, and new forms of keeping in touch. And so when young people demonstrate against white supremacists in a place like Charlottesville, that is seen by young people in Sri Lanka in the antipodes. When young people are claiming for freedom of expression in Hong Kong, or when young people are demonstrating for peace in Colombia, people can see and can hear about that around the world. So I do think that young people are demonstrating from the bottom up, and young people start organizing in the places where they are together. So it's very typical for young people to organize in schools because they are together there, in colleges because they are together in colleges or in universities. So those are places where young people get together. But there are other places where young people get together. Religious organizations are places where people get together, sports institutions, and so on. And so I think for young people, getting together is not the difficult part. Getting together with a purpose, that is the part that requires a lot of conversation, a lot of energy, a lot of persistence. But I think that today young people have the capacity to draw positive inspiration and positive examples very easily with the click on a cell phone.
That's great. So today we have at least 10 or 12 countries, young people from these countries engaging, watching, commenting. And for many of them today, we would encourage you, if you have friends in your own community that still don't fully comprehend these issues or don't even agree, but need to hear some compelling evidence and story and narrative, please feel free to share this content. You can do it by sharing the content from the Global Unites Facebook page. You can also share content from our Twitter page at Global Unites, and also on Instagram at Global Unites_official. These are ways that you could continue to engage. But also your own country's networks. With Sri Lanka Unites Facebook page, we have Uganda Unites, Kenya Unites. All these country chapters have their own Facebook pages, and you can look at relevant ways in your own country, and maybe even some guidance as to what you could do in your country. But there is a concern. It's definitely a huge opportunity with the social networks and the new technology for us to communicate and engage. But there is a fear that sometimes our generation and many of the millennials are limited to a word that's now being coined keyboard activism, where we feel that by just sharing something, just liking something, and just even going on a rant on social media, that we have done our part. Now, from your generation, where you'll have to come and get involved, engage, build relationships and all that, how do we use this but not stop there? How do you continue to encourage young people to do that? What are some examples you've seen now of people tangibly getting involved?
Yeah, I have heard the expression slacktivism. No, I actually think that the accusation is unfair. And I think that probably when I was in my 20s, people who did activism in the 60s thought that my generation was being probably too soft. So I wouldn't say that people who are active in networks are not doing enough. I think that it is already something. And that in fact, we still have not grasped as a society the enormous consequences of the communications revolution that we are living. And it is very possible that that this is only going to grow more, and that activists who are working in social networks, in social media, are onto something. It would be nice to have people getting off the screens and having direct interactions, for sure. But I would say that is complementary, not alternative to cyber activism. And even people who are very active in the cyberspace and people who are very active in electronic activism can get together. In my country, in Peru, every few months there is something called the hackathon. And the hackathon is a place where all these bloggers and certainly hackers and other people get together and talk about things that I don't understand at all, right? But that are indicating their concerns and their willingness to engage. So I do think that you should keep doing what you're doing, and just try to find more and additional ways to expand what you're doing and make it even more effective.
Well, we got one more question from Boy Pasha from the Democratic Republic of Congo. He says, how do you approach transitional justice in environments where impunity is a major societal problem? Watching from the Congo, he says.
Yes, I have been actually in the Congo, and indeed it's a society with deep problems. And it is important and worth it to remember that many of these issues in our young societies have to do with the colonial past, which was not so far away. When you think that the Congo was a colony of Belgium only 3 generations ago, when you think that colonialism had Sri Lanka and India in its clutches only 3 generations ago, you realize that yes, there are situations of weak rule of law, weak institutions, but let's cut ourselves a little bit of slack. We are still very young societies. 3 generations to build an entirely new society in the long term, in a historical view, is still very little. So we need to persist, but we also need to have a sense of historical patience. It's strange to talk about patience when you talk to an audience of young people. I'm not saying that you need to be patient with your energy and with your youth, but I think that you need to look into history, into the long term. And in the long term, we are still very young societies, and we need to keep persisting. Impunity is discouraging. The fact that you see people who committed horrendous crimes having and clinging on to power is discouraging, because it teaches the lesson that it doesn't matter what you do to stay in power, that it doesn't matter if you're corrupt, that it doesn't matter if you use violence to take care of your rivals, that the only thing that matters is money and power and access to networks of power. So impunity is discouraging, and I see why it would be discouraging in a place like my country, in Peru, or in the DRC. But I do think that that if you look at things with historical optimism, you realize that the fact that there are young people asking this is an element of hope. That people asking this can get together and can launch the kind of movements that are going to regain their countries for themselves.
Thank you. Kapil Ramanayaka from southern Sri Lanka says, what is the main challenge the newly democratic government faces in bringing about prosecutions?
Well, what typically happens is that when you have come out of an authoritarian regime, or when you have come out of a situation of enormous violence, the country still has spoilers. There are still representatives of the old regime with a lot of strength, with presence in the media, presence in politics, presence in the economics of the country. And the new governments, the new policymakers fear that touching in one way or another the past is going to upset the delicate balances that exist. Right? This is the classic problem of transitional justice, not just in Sri Lanka, but in my country and in any country undergoing some kind of attempt to build democracy. Think of this example that comes from my region, from Latin America. Do you think that after 18 years of brutal military dictatorship in Chile, with General Pinochet, a brutal dictator, do you think that the new government, the new civilian government, after General Pinochet, didn't fear that doing justice was going to be problematic, was going to be risky. Of course, they knew it was going to be risky, but they were decided to do something, and they had civil society pressure to do something. So they were not able, in 1990 when Pinochet left power, they were not able to start right there with a prosecution against General Pinochet. But they started with reparations, they started with truth commissions, they started looking for the missing. And yes, many brave lawyers started filing criminal complaints against Pinochet and against the generals and against the henchmen of that fascist regime. And sure enough, it took time, it took about 8 years, but eventually, at some point, the courts of law, Chilean and international, caught up with Mr. Pinochet. So I see the difficulties, and I see why successor governments may fear upsetting the political balances, but I also see how eventually can be done. There are responses to this, and what governments in a country should do is to learn from the experiences of governments in other countries, because this has not been invented 2 or 3 years ago. This has been happening already. The quandaries of a government coming out of a conflict are not new. These are situations that we have lived in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in the former Yugoslavia. Coming out of a dictatorship are things that have happened in Brazil, that have happened in Chile, in Argentina, so in South Africa. So there are lessons, and political leaders should look into that, because they are not the first in this situation. And other political leaders with intelligence, prudence, and at the same time courage have been able to deal with spoilers.
So we're coming to the end of our time, but before we have about 3 minutes left, but then we are going to join on the Sri Lanka Unites Facebook page. We'll be coming live to talk specifically about Sri Lanka's context, especially because you've spent a significant amount of months in Sri Lanka and you have some insight on that, as I'm sure you have insight on many other countries as well. So we also then, 15 minutes after that, around 8:15 Sri Lanka time, we're going to go live on the Colombia Unida page to address some of the questions that we received in Spanish for our Spanish viewers. So if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Gonzalez, would you tell our Spanish viewers to join us on Colombia Unida in about 20 minutes?
Bueno, amigos de Colombia Unida, espero que se nos puedan unir a las 8:15 hora de Sri Lanka, que es, me parece, ya muy pronto, en unos cuantos minutos, así que envíen sus preguntas y podemos conversar sobre Colombia y la construcción de la paz.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. So that comes to the end of our conversation, our webinar. Would you like to leave some parting thoughts to those who have joined us? And I want to thank you all for joining us from countries all over the world, for asking very insightful questions and helping us in our own thinking as we try to engage as youth movements to create sustainable change. As I thank them, I want to give you some parting words from our special guest today. Mr. Gonzalez, over to you, your final thoughts.
Well, I do think that I can say this. I have been in Sri Lanka for over a year, and this is a country that I have come to love very deeply, to love and respect and appreciate. It's an incredible country that has everything, I think, to succeed, to be prosperous, to be a happy place. At the same time, it has such a complicated history, and it is a country where it is so difficult sometimes to build empathy across communities. Yet I think that for young people in Sri Lanka, from whatever community you come from, looking into peace, looking into justice issues, looking into intercommunal relations is an existential issue. It's not a luxury. It's actually something that you need to do, because you are going to be Sri Lankan the rest of your life. And getting to know what is to be Sri Lankan is fundamental, because that is something that will be with you and with your children. If you want to build your life in the place where you were born, with the family and the friends and the relatives that you have now, you have to take an active concern and an active role in the issues of your community and the issues of your nation. You don't have to be bounded by the prejudices of the past. The prejudices of the past are, in many cases, what fueled conflict. And you don't have to be bounded by that. You have the capacity to build different relations. And certainly, this is the country that you are going to build. So go for it.
All right. Thank you very much once again for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you. Once again, to all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, wherever you are. We are so honored that you took the time to be part of this conversation, but we're even more honored and proud of what you are going to do in your community. Never give up. We have to begin from the bottom up. You have to inspire generations after you. And you can be that generation that changes the destiny of your country. We have to do it now. Or as Mr. Gonzalez said, we should have done it yesterday. So let's get working. Have a great morning, evening, night, wherever you are. Join us again, once again, next month on the Global Unites as we discuss more on how youth can make an impact in our countries. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And now we do Colombia.
Yes.
Okay. All right. But who is going to read the questions in Spanish?
You are.